My HOA fined me for a fence I didn't own. I still remember opening that first envelope because the header was stamped in scary red, and because I had literally just moved in and was still living out of a box in the garage. Violation notice, unauthorized fence. I read it twice, then drove slowly around my little yard in my slippers like the fence might be invisible and only show up if I walked around it. There was no fence. There was a neat row of shrubs, a broken bird bath, and a patch of my neighbor's gravel that had been nibbling at our grass for years, but nothing that a reasonable person would call an unauthorized fence. I called the number on the letter. It went to voicemail for the HOA board president, who introduced himself as Alan Carter. His voicemail was precise, clipped. Leave your name, lot number, and a callback time. Violations will be processed within 72 hours. I left my name, lot, and said politely, there must be a mistake. I thought mistake would mean a friendly, oops, sorry, and then a follow-up email telling me whoever had filed the complaint had mixed up house numbers. Instead, I got a second letter 3 days later that said fines had been assessed, $50 per day starting immediately until noncompliance was remedied. That $50 per day got my stomach tightening because I am not someone who likes confrontation, and I had exactly 117 reasons in my bank account why $50 a day would be very meaningful. So I called again, and this time I reached Mr. Carter directly. I said, Alan, this is Jenna from 14 Maple. There's no fence. Did you send someone? He sighed like I had interrupted something vital and explained in a tone that made it sound like I was the one inconveniencing him. Our records show a fence in violation of Section 4.2.1 on the east boundary of Lot 14. We have photographs. Fines accrue until the fence is removed or a variance is granted. You need to come to the board meeting Thursday. There are photographs. I asked, who took them? I live alone and have been painting the kitchen all week. He said, a neighbor submitted a complaint and attached photo evidence with your lot number. I felt a cold little panic at the edges of my vision. But I don't own a fence, I said. He didn't soften. The board will handle it. He ended the call. That first week after the letter was the kind of small, escalating nightmare that lives in small towns of rules and clipboards. Every time I went to check my mailbox, there was another notice. My neighbors who had been waving at me in the driveway smiled a little stiffly. I found myself apologizing to the mail carrier because the fines were on my mind and made me feel, irrationally, like I had to be smaller in the world. The thought looped, who filed the complaint? Why would someone claim I had a fence I didn't have? Did the pictures show my house? I pulled up the photo that the HOA had attached in the portal. It was grainy, like most HOA enforcement photos tend to be, taken at an angle, with a fence visible and a yellow tag that read violation. I stared at it until the pixels blurred. It didn't look like my yard from that angle. The house across the street had a fence. My neighbor 2 houses down had a little white picket that I had admired. But the picture's lot lines and the angle didn't correspond to anything I recognized. I took a screenshot and sent it to the group chat I'd created with 2 neighbors who had been the friendliest, Maria at 12 Maple and Tom at 18. Maria texted back almost immediately, not yours. Tom wrote, that's Alan's fence, I'm not joking. He put that up last year, it's ugly. I thought Tom was a jokester. He loved dramatic opinions, so I didn't take it as evidence. But the thought lodged, Alan's fence. Was that possible? I went for a walk that afternoon and, as neighborhood small talk goes, asked Tom about the fence. He shrugged and said, he's been very particular about property lines since he became president. Built that fence right on the skinny strip between his yard and the cul-de-sac. You new folks will see how it goes. He loves the rules, so why would he fine me? I asked. He doesn't know you yet, Tom said without malice, just like someone naming a weather pattern. That didn't help. The next escalation happened fast. A second, sterner letter arrived threatening lien action if fines weren't paid, and it had a line at the bottom that made my pulse spike. Failure to respond will result in escalation to the county and legal counsel. There is nothing like a formal legal threat to make a person who has lived by the book suddenly wonder whether she should sleep with a flashlight and tenaciousness. I considered paying the fine to make it stop, but it felt wrong to throw money at a claim that didn't belong to me. I was also terrified of setting a precedent. If I paid it, would it become a daily toll? I thought about hiring a lawyer and felt incandescently ridiculous. This was a fence in a cul-de-sac, not a television series. So I began my own low-budget investigation. Call it stubborn or naive, but a lot of good things start when you decide you are not going to be gaslit into paying for someone else's fence. Step 1 was basic. I pulled the property deed I'd been handed at closing and compared it with the HOA's map, which they posted publicly in a PDF on their site. I also dug out the title report that the title company had given me and the tax assessor's online map. All of the public records matched what I remembered from closing. My property line ran where the row of shrubs was. It did not include a single vertical wooden slat. The HOA's violation photo, however, seemed to identify my lot number over the top of a fence that was farther east than the line on the assessor map. It was possible that the assessor was wrong, I thought. It seemed unlikely. I called my lender's closing attorney, who assured me the deed and title should be accurate. Still, the HOA kept emailing demands. The second stage of escalation involved personality. Alan emailed me an official-sounding message copying the board. Owner of Lot 14 needs to correct fencing or request variance. Failure to abide will result in fines. He used my first name in an oddly formal way, which is a thing people do when they are trying to be friendly without actually being friendly. I replied with photos of my yard from multiple angles and a sentence that read, politely, "There is no fence on Lot 14, I live at 14, and I moved in 3 months ago." He answered, "We will see you at the meeting. Photos attached to the violation are conclusive." To me, conclusive meant he was done listening. That made me angrier than the fine had made me. I spent the next days like a detective on a tight budget. I walked houses with my phone camera, took timestamps of my front yard from various angles, and asked neighbors, particularly those who lived across the street, to look at the picture. Mrs. Lane at 9 Maple lived in the oldest house on the block and loved to talk. She invited me onto her porch with a plate of cookies and said, "People are fast to accuse, dear. Always nicer to ask than to fine." She also said something that sent me back to my own house with a new thought. Carter's been touchy about that tiny strip of land since he planted those shrubs. He measured it 3 times last year. That frame, measured 3 times, made me wonder if Alan had a theory he wanted to preserve, and if so, whether he would fight to keep it even if reality disagreed. I could feel this turning into a personality versus paperwork fight, and when personalities are involved, people get messy. I brought our neighbor Maria into the loop formally. Maria had lived here for 6 years and was an assistant city planner at the county office. She agreed to look at the public records with me. She read the assessor's map, then the HOA's map, then the deed, then the violation photo. "There's a mismatch," she said finally, and that felt like progress because at least it was an external expert of sorts, saying something I already suspected. "It looks like their map might have a different baseline," she said. "But that's not something you fix with an email." Her tone was quietly useful. "You get a survey." I had a split-second panic at the price. Surveys cost money. I'm not wealthy, and $800 feels like a lot if you are not sure you'll win. But Maria's eyes were steady and patient. "The survey will give you an official boundary. You'll need it for the meeting." So I did the math on a credit card and called a surveyor. Someone named Dan, who had a friendly, gravelly voice and smelled faintly of a mechanic, came out in a truck with a ladder of flags and an air of slow competence. He measured and paced, and used little devices that beeped and made maps. He told me the work would take a couple of hours, and that he'd file the certificate of survey within a week. "You want to be sure," he said, "about where your fences sit." When Dan emailed me the report, I sat on the kitchen floor with it in my hands like a person holding a sudden new map of the world. Survey stated the boundaries clearly. It showed precisely where my lot started and ended. It showed the little strip of land with the cultivated shrubs that literally had my name attached to them in the deed. And it showed a wooden fence farther east, with a set of coordinates that actually fell within the property owned by H. Allen Carter. It was almost comical how exact the lines were, like a children's book drawing labeling "This is mine," and "This is yours." For the first time since the first letter, I felt a sense of air getting to my brain again. I printed the survey, made color photocopies, and wrote a short, restrained email to the board attaching the report and asking to have the fines suspended pending review. The reply came back from Alan within an hour. "Surveyor paid by interested party will not be considered." You could have put a hot poker in my throat with that sentence. Interested party, was he saying I had an angle? He had, it seemed, already decided the narrative. The new homeowner must be trouble, survey paid by me therefore biased, fines valid. That felt less like the HOA running a community, and more like the HOA wanting to win an argument. At the next board meeting, which, by the way, is the most theatrical place in the world for small grievances, because suddenly everyone's eyebrows are on stage, I showed up early and brought a binder. The knot in my stomach made the walk from my car feel like a halftime tunnel. Board members clustered around Alan like small satellites. The HOA secretary, a woman with an impeccable bun named Denise, acted like a notary in training, and there were 3 neighbors, Tom, Maria, Mrs. Lane, plus a handful of others who looked curious. I had rehearsed twice. I did not imagine I would be one of those people who rehearsed how to be reasonable, but apparently I was. Alan opened the meeting with the usual items: pool maintenance, landscaping schedule, and then, in a voice that was too bright, Lot 14 violation. He laid the violation photo on the table, like an indictment. He said, "We followed due process. Owner of Lot 14 has failed to remedy a non-compliant fence. Fines stand. Any comments?" I felt the room tilt slightly. Some neighbors nodded as if they'd seen the photo. I stood up and said, "My name is Jenna. I moved in 3 months ago. I don't have a fence. I hired a licensed surveyor who shows the fence in question is on Lot 16. Alan's smile was thin. "Your survey was paid by you," he said, "and until the board reviews it, fines are in effect." That was the moment I realized how quickly process can be weaponized. Rules exist to be fair, and they can also be used to pass off authority without accountability. I kept my voice steady. "I am asking the board to put the fines on hold until the evidence is properly reviewed. The county assessor's map and my deed also corroborate the survey." He said, "We have to follow our enforcement procedures. We're not going to stop compliance." Tom stood unexpectedly, and his voice had a low, amused edge when he said, "Alan, you've been measuring that strip so often I thought you were trying to win an Olympic medal. The fence is on your property." A few neighbors snorted softly, and Alan's jaw tightened. The meeting became a war of deference and small legalisms. The board could have tabled the issue, or voted to pause fines until a proper review, which is what a reasonably administered board would have done. Instead, Alan seemed determined to lean in. He tried to disqualify the survey, to raise technicalities about who paid for it, to suggest the coordinates were inaccurate, to imply the survey had been rushed. At one point, Denise favored him with a look that said, "We don't want to make waves," which was the board's institutional mantra for keeping status quo. I felt the temperature in the room climb. The tide of neighbors shifted. Some were on my side once they saw the diagram, others were blank. A member, Beth from 20 Maple, asked, "Do we have any official boundary from the county? Can Alan show his documentation of where this fence sits relative to the community map?" Alan said he had a copy of the HOA's recorded map, and that it supported their enforcement letters. He offered to show it, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, when he projected the HOA map, it was not the same as the county map. It was like watching 2 versions of a legend. One used different starting points to trace property lines, and the one Alan presented had a slight shift east. Maria, who stumbled into the role of translator of municipal jargon, pointed out that the HOA's internal map had apparently been redrawn without proper reference to the original plat. "Whoever updated this map may have used a different datum," she said. "You can't just shift lines and then fine people." Alan's voice, meanwhile, began to take on a defensive edge that was almost like hearing gravity between 2 tectonic plates. "We were doing maintenance on the landscaping boundaries and updated our records," he said. "We did what any board would do to maintain consistency." A man in the back raised his hand to ask whether the board had ever sent a notice to anyone else. Another woman said, "Why are we even fighting this? If the survey places the fence on Alan's lot, we can stop the fines and ask him to move the fence or apply for a variance." At that, Alan snapped. "I'm the president of this association. I enforce its rules." He said it like a finality, like the position itself gave him the right to be an unappealable authority. The room went quiet because there is nothing people like more at a homeowners meeting than a spectacle of someone being a little too proud of their clipboard. My voice, which felt a little hoarse, said, "I didn't come here to take anyone's yard. I came here because I'm being told to pay fines for something that isn't mine. I just want fairness." Alan leaned forward and said in a tone that was a little sharp, "We can't just rely on privately paid surveys. You can pause the fines," Maria said. "You're the board. That's literally within your power." There was a moment, a brief stall in the pattern that had been building for weeks, where the board could have chosen to de-escalate. But the board members, perhaps from inertia or loyalty or fear of appearing weak, did not. Alan objected, again and again, to the survey's validity. He asked for evidence of the surveyor's license. He asked for proof the surveyor had observed corner pins. He argued that the photographic evidence previously submitted still showed an unauthorized fence, and that technicalities of line of sight could explain the discrepancy. In the middle of his monologue, Tom interrupted and said, "We have posted photographs from before the fence was installed. People were at block parties. Alan built that fence in 2019. Tom's tone was stubbornly factual in a way that cut to the heart of it. Someone had watched the fence go up, and their memory didn't match the board's enforcement against me. The board finally agreed to table the fines for a temporary period of 30 days to have a neutral third-party review. It felt like a small victory, suspending fines while the review was completed, but there was an aftertaste. Alan's expression had been closed off and small. You could see he was not happy to be paused. That night I slept poorly, because vindication feels like a pressure valve you haven't actually turned yet. The real twist of the story didn't come from the survey itself. The survey had been the scaffolding for the revelation. The twist came when, in the 30-day pause, I started going through the HOA's public meeting minutes, available online because, of course, all homeowner drama is archived for future historians. I found an entry from 2 years earlier, where the HOA had voted to approve a landscaping plan that included moving the boundary hedges and clarifying lot lines for maintenance. The vote had been recorded, and Alan had chaired it. There was a sentence that said, blandly, "The board authorizes the transfer of maintenance responsibility for the east buffer to Lot 16 owner." That line was a bureaucratic pebble that suddenly became an avalanche. I dug further and found an email chain among board members from around the time the fence went up. In those emails, one line echoed, "We've redrawn based on our measurements, small discrepancies. Owner on Lot 16 is comfortable with the placement." The owner on Lot 16 turned out to be Alan. New evidence, minutes, emails, and a few old photos from a neighborhood yard sale showing the fence being assembled, hardened into a different story. The fence had been placed by Alan, he had known the ambiguity in the lines, and the HOA's internal map had been altered in a way that was convenient for him. The thing that made my heart race was a phrase in one of the emails that read, "If we ever need to enforce, we'll have the map." That phrasing made everything look less like an unfortunate bureaucratic error and more like a strategy for controlling a narrative. I don't like to accuse people of malice if a simpler explanation will do, so I kept reminding myself of the smaller option. Alan simply believed his map was correct and was zealous in enforcing it. But who writes an email that says, "If we ever need to enforce, we'll have the map"? It makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I printed the emails and put them with my binder for the second board meeting, which by then had become a salt-and-iron affair that felt less like a community gathering and more like a small-scale courtroom drama. I was nervous, but keyed in a way I hadn't been before. This felt like defending not just my property, but the right to be treated as an equal citizen under a rulebook. The night of the second meeting, more neighbors came. Folks I had never seen showed up and sat like an audience at a town hall. Alan looked pained and a little wary. His bluster had been punctured by the interim pause, and that was visible. I took turns presenting evidence, the county assessor map, the deed, the survey. And carefully, I slid the printouts of the board minutes and the internal emails across the table. The room hummed with the sound of shoes shuffling. Alan turned pale as he scanned the email that mentioned, "If we ever need to enforce." He tried to talk his way out of it, attempted to claim those were internal musings about maintenance, but Tom had prepared a slow, quiet question. "Did you alter the HOA's map to make the fence appear to be in Lot 14? Alan's answer was to say, evasively, "We updated records. Why?" Tom asked. "To maintain clear boundaries," Alan said, but his voice had a flicker of something like guilt. The board president's face tightened, and he asked to have time to respond formally, but the board voted to table his request. The crucial moment, the one that made the room tilt, happened when the association's treasurer, not someone connected to Alan, spoke up and said, "You can't use enforcement to retroactively justify single-owner improvements on common understanding." It was a careful sentence that put the process itself on trial. The board then voted to form a 5-member committee to review all evidence and produce a recommendation to the board within 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, the committee called an emergency meeting. They had conducted an independent review, checked the county's plat map, verified Dan the surveyor's credentials, and read the email chain. Their recommendation was unequivocal. Fines should be rescinded, any enforcement action should be retracted, and the HOA should issue a formal apology. They also recommended that Alan abstain from matters relating to his property due to a conflict of interest. It was an outcome I'd been rooting for like an exhausted marathon runner clause for a finish line. The board, under pressure, had to accept the committee's recommendations. Alan, facing the facts and the dwindling room for maneuver, announced he would step down from the presidency and recuse himself from fence-related matters. His face was tight as someone who had been the quarterback of a small, imagined kingdom, realizing the kingdom was not, In fact, his to command. He read a brief statement at the end of the meeting that was carefully composed. In light of the committee's findings, I regret any confusion. I have served proud as president and will step aside to avoid any further conflict. He did not say sorry in a tone that felt real. Instead, he used the built-in language of corporate apologetics. But he did step down. The HOA sent an email to all residents the next day, rescinding the fines and promising to reimburse me for the cost of the survey. They also agreed to review their internal procedures for making map edits and to institute a policy requiring 2 independent verifications before enforcement action. When I received the refund check for the survey a week later, it felt anticlimactic in a way. Money is a tidy thing, but it doesn't get you back the sleep you lost or the shadow of suspicion that hangs when a community process turns on you. There's an after that people don't talk about as much. The neighbors who had been friendly became more cautious. Some avoided me as if proximity to a contest had been contagious. Others came by with casseroles and offered their versions of solidarity. Maria's face was almost tired but pleased. Tom brought a jug of iced tea and said, "People like to make rules when they are bored," which was possibly the best summation of the entire saga. I wanted to be satisfied, and I was, vindicated on paper, reimbursed on the ledger. But I also felt the weird human tug of empathy. I hadn't wanted Alan to become a villain. I had wanted the board to be the board. What surprised me most was how everyone's assumptions about power and process had been exposed. People had given Alan authority in trusting him to act responsibly. Power then had been used to preserve small, private interests. The victory was not about shaming Alan as much as about restoring a baseline of civility, where maps are maps, and people are asked questions before being fined. I learned, painfully, a few things that have stayed with me. First, keep your paperwork and take pictures. A tidy binder of rightness goes further than rage. Second, bureaucracy has teeth and will bite if you let it. Meet the board with facts and with neighbors, because rules are social things as much as legal ones. Third, fairness usually wins when it is pursued calmly and publicly. The last scene that closed the chapter was small and oddly peaceful. Alan sold his house 6 months later. The for sale sign went up without fanfare, and a young couple moved in. The HOA elected a new president who was less theatrical and more interested in transparency. They created a review committee and gave it a small budget. He never physically rebuilt the relationship with Alan. There was a thin frost for a while, but some neighbors slowly resumed their previous warmth. "Mrs. Lane gave me a jar of jam and a short speech. Sometimes people start fences between themselves and the world, and sometimes the world tells them the fence is on the wrong property." I laughed and cried in a single awkward moment, and realized how petty and profound the whole experience had been. Did it change my love of this house? A little. I now keep a copy of the survey in the kitchen drawer with the important documents. I still plant 2 extra bulbs along the line every spring, because I like staking out little joys where the rulebook once tried to stake me. I don't regret standing up. It would have been easier to pay, because there is a dignity in not allowing your life to be defined by someone else's misapplied authority. If you're new to a community and you ever find yourself with a letter in red threatening fines for something you didn't do, here's what I'd ask you. Who holds the map and who watches the watchers? Ask those questions before you pay, and keep your paper trail tight. It isn't always pretty or immediate, but in a neighborhood, truth tends to have a way of showing up if you invite it in with good records and stubborn calm.